one thinks of Filipino music today, classical music probably does not come to mind. The Philippines is separated from Europe by a few oceans and was primarily influenced by Spain for more than 300 years. Not a country particularly known for their classical music, other than classical guitar and zarzuela. The closest thing to European classical music that Filipinos have are ecclesiastical music, written for the church, and also the genre of kundiman. While acoustically similar, however, they are not quite the same. That being said, the Philippines does have a vibrant classical music community. We have professional musicians, soloists who put on concerts. We even put on an opera a while back, Gaetano Donizetti's Lucia de la Marmur, with Filipino-American tenor Arthur Espiritu singing the male lead Edgardo. There is even a tradition of Filipino classical composers, from Nicanor Abelardo to Antonio Molina to Josefino Chino Toledo in the present day. Amongst those great names is Felipe Padilla de Leon, who has been described as perhaps the greatest Filipino classical composer of the post-war period, and certainly the most well-known. Before we begin, I'd just like to extend our gratitude to Alvin Borbola Arante and the De La Salle University Library for granting us access to this interview which Mr. Arante conducted with Felipe Padilla de Leon in 1979. It really helped us understand De Leon and his mindset and why he composed his music. It's an invaluable resource, and for that, we thank you.
Felipe Padilla de Leon was born on May 1, 1912, in Papaya, now General Tino, Nueva Ecija. He was part of a musical family, with his siblings participating in the local zarzuela. In his childhood, the Spanish influence on local music was still alive, with many turning to the zarzuela, the opera, and the classical music for entertainment. His first passion, however, was painting. He enrolled in the School of Fine Arts in the University of the Philippines in 1928, dreaming of becoming a great painter, but discovered that he could not get anything for his work. Due to the Great Depression, he was forced to return to Nueva Ecija, where he was recruited by his neighborhood maestro as a horn and later as a slide trombone player. While he was struggling to earn anything from his painting, he was paid handsomely for his performances, which led to him switching to music. During this time of his life, he also worked as an ice cream vendor, a canasta driver, and a sampaguita seller, just to name a few, to earn some money for him and his family, who were in poverty. After spending some time as a performer, he felt the urge to write his own music. Without really knowing the technique, and with nothing but music and ideas in his head, he slowly wrote a fantasy for trombone, which was very well received. Following the advice of his trombone teacher, he enrolled in the Conservatory of Music in the University of the Philippines, where he was formally trained in composition. He then continued his studies abroad under Vittorio Giannini in the Juilliard School of Music in New York.
We will now take a look at one of Felipe Padilla de Leon's compositions. Throughout his career, he composed in the Western classical style, and did some orchestral works, choral works, and perhaps the two best-known operas in the Filipino language, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. Now, this is Concertstück for violin and orchestra, composed sometime in the 1950s, and recorded here in 1959 by Carmencita Lozada and the UP Symphony Orchestra. Century, it is definitely of the style of the Romantic period. You have beautiful, flowing passages alternating with awe-inspiring virtuosic parts. Further reinforcing the Romantic influence are Romantic playing techniques. For the soloist, you have the off of a double stop, so playing two notes on different strings at the same time. You have notes that go really high up the fingerboard, and you have pizzicato, or plugging the string, with either right hand or the left hand too. You have note arrangements that are not traditionally Baroque or classical. For the orchestra, you've got a big Romantic period orchestra with winds and horns and percussion. You've got the strings playing tremolo, like this, to give a sort of mystic feel. And you've got some really beautiful dynamics, from very soft and intimate to very loud, grand and bombastic. In some ways, it's similar to another violin concerto, the one by Tchaikovsky. You have this theme that's introduced, and both the soloist and orchestra return to it again and again, sometimes together. And this applies to both the first and third movement of the Tchaikovsky concerto, by the way. In terms of temperament, it also is kind of similar to the Tchaikovsky concerto, but also to Richard Strauss's tone poem Don Juan, especially at the start. It's very grand, bombastic, almost jaunty, and it feels like you're going on an adventure. Truly, it's a great work, and I do wish it is recorded very soon.
De Leon was not just a composer of Western style classical music, though he also composed what could probably be best described as folk music. For example, famous Filipino Christmas songs such as Pasko na naman and Noche Buena are by De Leon. Other folk songs such as Magtanim ay Di Biro and even Bahay Kubo are sometimes attributed to him. Bahay Kubo is definitely not a De Leon composition, by the way, appearing in the 1920s, but Magtanim ay Di Biro is a bit more probable as to why seemingly nobody asked De Leon himself in the 80s or 90s. I do not know why.
As the country's premier composer for a time, De Leon was also commissioned to compose some politically motivated music, let's say. During the Japanese occupation, he composed the piece Awit sa Paglilikha ng Bagong Pilipinas, which intended to celebrate the Second Philippine Republic and the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In a similar vein, he was commissioned to compose music for Ferdinand Marcos' Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, such as the hymn Bagong Lipunan and the march Bagong Pagsilang. It is worth noting, however, that at least according to his son Felipe Mendoza de Leon, he inserted some subversive elements into this political music. For example, in the Bagong Pagsilang March, there is apparently a quotation of the protest song Bayan Ko.
His musical philosophy was based on writing music that faithfully expressed the feelings of Filipino. He wanted his music to be alive in the hearts of the people, and as someone who lived among and mixed with the people, he felt that he absorbed the inner way of life, and he wanted to reflect that in his music. He felt that Filipino music possessed certain peculiar characteristics which adapted to the basic taste and temperament of the Filipino and manifested their psychology, character, and individuality. He was proud of his people, and he wanted to write music for them.
Felipe Padilla de Leon passed away on December 5, 1992. By then, he was one of the country's most famous and well-respected composers, as well as a recipient of awards such as the Republic Cultural Heritage Award, the Rizal Centennial Award, and the Presidential Medal of Merit, among many others. In 1997, he posthumously received the highest honor for Filipino artists, a place in the Order of National Artists. His musical tradition has carried on through his family with his son Felipe Mendoza de Leon and his grandson Diwa de Leon, becoming accomplished musicians and composers.
Well, there you have it. Felipe Padilla de Leon, one of the greatest Filipino composers of classical and folk music. Yet, there is still one more thing that needs to be said. In this 1979 interview, De Leon complains that while Filipinos have been composing great music, they are not recorded, meaning that Filipino composers are still unrecognized internationally and even in their home country. Unfortunately, this is still the case today. Many of De Leon's own music only survives on the internet through an old recording from the 50s, 60s, or 70s, if they are recorded at all. The sheet music probably exists somewhere, and perhaps it is taken out once in a while for a performance, but it is still inaccessible to most people. That's a shame, really, because this is some truly great music. If we could just get a professional recording of some of De Leon's works, we can remind the Filipinos that great Filipino classical music did exist, and hopefully will continue to exist.
Kundi may pag